You don't notice it at first. That's the trap. The damage doesn't start with loud failures or visible breakdowns. It starts with subtle agreements you make with yourself. It starts with a whisper that sounds like your own voice. A gentle voice telling you what you want to hear, not what you need to hear. And so you follow it, because it doesn't sound like temptation. It sounds like reason, like care, like safety. That voice isn't neutral. It's not your higher self. It's not clarity. It's your ego. And it's not here to ruin your life in one dramatic blow. It's here to dismantle your self-control 1 inch at a time. One decision, one excuse, one delayed intention. That's all it takes. And by the time you feel the weight of your scattered discipline, the ego has already moved on, wearing another disguise, telling another comforting lie. You were never taught how to recognize it. Because ego isn't just arrogance. It isn't about being loud or proud or boastful. Sometimes ego hides behind humility. Sometimes it hides behind fear. Sometimes it hides behind productivity. That's what makes it so dangerous. It doesn't come to fight you. It comes to become you. And once it does, it doesn't need to overpower you. It only needs to persuade. This is where self-control dies. Not in rage, not in chaos, but in quiet surrender to the ego's logic. You'll hear it say things like, "You've earned a break. You'll start tomorrow. No one will notice. It's just once." And because those words sound reasonable, you agree. You say yes to ego and no to your own standard. And then, in a moment that feels so small, a fracture opens inside you. This isn't a video about motivation. You don't need more noise. You don't need a voice shouting over the ego. You need to understand it. You need to see its patterns so clearly that it can't deceive you anymore. That's what breaks the spell. Awareness, not effort, is the beginning of true control. We're not here to kill the ego. That's not possible. We're here to expose it, gently, precisely. Like peeling away a mask that's been fused to your face for years. And underneath, you'll find something far more powerful than the ego ever offered. You'll find the quiet, steady, focused version of yourself you've been trying to become. But to reach that version, you have to begin here, at the first point of sabotage. The voice that doesn't sound like the enemy. The voice that sounds like you. Now we begin. The ego doesn't announce itself. It doesn't walk into your thoughts wearing a name tag. It doesn't say, "Hey, I'm here to ruin your discipline today." That would be easy to spot, easy to resist. Instead, it enters silently. And when it speaks, it uses your tone, your words, your inner vocabulary. It knows how to imitate your values, not to serve them, but to bend them just enough to keep you from changing. That's what makes it so effective. The voice doesn't feel foreign. It feels familiar. It feels like self-compassion when it says, "You've had a hard day, you deserve this." It feels like caution when it says, "Maybe now's not the right time." It feels like wisdom when it says, "Wait until you're more prepared." But beneath all those comforting phrases is a single motive: delay. Delay the hard thing. Delay the silence. Delay the discomfort that leads to growth. The ego doesn't want you to suffer. It wants you to stay the same. And if staying the same requires comfort, it will offer you softness. If it requires pride, it will make you feel superior. If it requires fear, it will flood you with doubt. It has no moral compass, only strategy. And its only mission is to protect the identity you've already built, even if that identity is broken. So how do you recognize the voice of ego? You listen for the tone. The ego always sounds urgent. It always speaks in absolutes. It wants you to decide fast, without reflection. It doesn't ask questions. It delivers conclusions. And when you challenge it, it gets defensive. It creates a flood of justifications. If your inner voice is explaining too much, rationalizing too hard, or reacting too quickly, that's ego, not clarity. Clarity is quiet. It's not reactive. It doesn't beg to be followed. It doesn't panic when questioned. It simply knows. And that knowing doesn't come from desire or fear. It comes from alignment. That's the voice you want to hear. But you won't find it in the first impulse. You'll only find it after you ignore the ego's monologue long enough to hear something deeper. Most people never wait that long. They act on the first voice, the loudest one, the one that feels most familiar. And because ego has been rehearsing those lines for years, of course, it sounds like the truth. But repetition isn't truth. Comfort isn't truth. Truth is what remains after all the stories dissolve, after the ego's performance ends. Start paying attention, not to the content of your thoughts, but to their tone. Ask yourself, who is really speaking right now? Is it the part of you that wants short-term relief, or the part that wants long-term alignment? Is it the part that craves validation, or the part that values integrity? One of those voices is your ego. The other is your potential. You'll know the difference not by how they feel, but by what they cost you. Ego will always cost you your peace. It will always push you to act fast, defend yourself, protect your image, win the moment. Your true self doesn't need any of that. It's not trying to win, it's trying to live clearly. The next time you hear that inner voice pushing you, flattering you, rushing you, ask yourself this: is this voice trying to protect me, or just protect my ego? That one question can break the entire spell. Now that we've exposed the disguise, it's time to look at how the ego weaponizes your own victories. Because sometimes, the moment you feel most proud is when it starts to ruin you. The greatest illusion the ego creates is not its presence, but its disguise. It doesn't storm into your mind with arrogance. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand. It whispers. And that whisper sounds exactly like your own thoughts. It doesn't feel like an enemy. It feels like reason, like instinct, like self-preservation, but slowly, it becomes your standard interpreter. You don't even realize it's taken the microphone, because it doesn't announce itself. It just speaks in your voice. You hear it when you're tired, when you're overwhelmed, when you've already broken one promise and want to justify breaking another. The ego steps in, not as resistance, but as rescue. It tells you you've done enough, that you're being too hard on yourself, that now isn't the time. And because it uses words you've used before, because it speaks with your cadence, you trust it. You trust the wrong voice. And with that trust, you lose control. The ego doesn't need to lie. All it needs to do is exaggerate. It takes a grain of truth and builds a story out of it. You're exhausted. That part is real. But the story that says you deserve to escape your discipline, that part is ego. And the more emotional you are, the louder that story becomes. Ego loves emotion. It feeds on it. It's the fastest way in. Because logic takes time. Emotion is instant. And the ego thrives in speed. You tell yourself you're being rational, that you're listening to your body, that you're following your gut. But ask yourself this: if your gut always leads you to avoid what's hard, if your instinct always points toward comfort, is that still wisdom? Or is it well-rehearsed fear? The ego doesn't care about your growth. It cares about your survival. And to the ego, survival means sameness. Anything unfamiliar, anything uncertain is danger. And it will talk you out of every challenge that threatens your old identity, even if that identity is the very thing you're trying to escape. The voice of the ego often shows up with confidence, but without clarity. It speaks first, loudest, fastest. It convinces you that speed equals truth, that action must come now, that hesitation means weakness. But strength is not the ability to act quickly. Strength is the ability to pause and see, to look at a thought and ask, where is this voice taking me? If you don't ask that question, The ego answers for you. That's how you lose self-control, not in one blow, but in 1,000 subtle agreements. You tell yourself, it's just one time. It's just a small break. I'll get back on track tomorrow. But none of those words are neutral. They're not harmless. They're the scripts your ego has written and rehearsed for years. And every time you follow them, you reinforce the part of yourself that wants relief, not evolution. Clarity has no urgency. It doesn't push, it doesn't panic, it waits, it watches, and it lets you choose. But the ego can't afford to wait. If you pause, if you reflect, you might see through it. So it speeds up your decision. It makes you feel like you have no time, no room, no option but to react. And that reaction becomes your pattern. You think you're in charge, but are you? Or are you just obeying a voice you never questioned? Real self-control begins the moment you stop taking your thoughts at face value. When you notice a desire rising or a story forming, ask, is this voice building my future or protecting my past? Because that's the split. One voice is leading you forward. The other is chaining you to who you've always been. The ego is clever. It tells you you're being wise when you're being scared. It tells you you're being compassionate when you're avoiding responsibility. It tells you that rest is self-love, even when rest is really just disguised escape. And because you crave peace, you believe it, not realizing the price you pay for that peace is your own momentum. You don't silence the ego by force, you silence it by exposure. You catch it in the act, you let it speak, and then you listen deeper. Beneath that voice, there's another one. It speaks softly. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't scare. It simply reminds you of what you said you wanted, what you claimed you valued, what you committed to in moments of clarity. That voice doesn't argue. It just waits to be remembered. That's your real voice, the one you buried under years of internal noise. You don't need to invent discipline. You need to return to it, and you can't return to it if you're still confusing ego with truth. So the next time you hear the voice, the one that sounds just like you, pause. Let it speak. Then ask one question. Would the strongest version of me believe this? If the answer is no, then neither should you. Now that the mask has been pulled off, we move to the next layer, where ego doesn't stop you with weakness, but with pride. Because the more proud you feel, the easier it becomes to lose everything you've built. The ego doesn't always sabotage you by making you feel small. Sometimes it ruins you by making you feel too big. Not with arrogance, but with subtle pride. The kind of pride that feels earned, deserved, the kind that follows a productive morning or a disciplined week. And that's when the ego steps in, gently, with a hand on your shoulder and a smile on its face. It tells you you've done well, that you've earned the right to loosen your grip. Just for a moment. This is how the ego weaponizes progress. It turns your victories into justifications. It says, you've been consistent. Relax a little. You didn't quit. You deserve a reward. You've been focused. A small distraction won't hurt. And because those statements feel true, you agree. You give yourself permission to drift. But it's not a gift. It's a crack. And that crack widens. You don't notice the damage right away. That's part of the trap. The ego knows how to keep the cost hidden. For now. It knows that if it can convince you to break your momentum slowly, invisibly, you won't notice the reversal. And then when you fall, it will say, see, that's just who you are. The same voice that lifted you up now shames you for falling, because it never wanted your growth. It only wanted control. The ego thrives on comfort, and pride is one of its most effective comforts. It feeds you the story that you're ahead, that you're above the need for repetition, that your past effort means you can ease up now. But discipline doesn't care about yesterday. It's only real if it's repeated. One moment of strength doesn't erase the need for the next one, and yet the ego tells you it does. This is why so many people sabotage themselves right after a breakthrough. They wake up earlier for 3 days, and on the 4th they sleep in, proud of the progress they just destroyed. They eat clean for a week, then binge, satisfied with the illusion of balance. They speak with calm during one argument and let rage take over the next, congratulating themselves for at least trying. It's a trap. Progress doesn't need a reward. It is the reward. But the ego tells you otherwise because it doesn't want you to build permanence. It wants you to flirt with growth, not marry it. Self-control isn't just tested in weakness. It's tested in strength. When you're tired, when you're hurting, the ego comes through the back door whispering excuses. But when you're proud, when you're winning, it walks right through the front. It congratulates you, then leads you off the path. And because the praise feels good, you follow. You have to learn to see the trap inside the compliment. Not to reject the progress, but to refuse to be seduced by it. Yes, you're improving. Yes, you're stronger. But that strength must not soften your resolve. It should harden it. Because the more you grow, the more dangerous the ego becomes. In the beginning, it fights you with doubt. Later, it fights you with pride. The highest form of self-control is not built in your lowest moments. It's built in your highest. When everything is going well, when you're tempted to relax, when the rewards are piling up, that's when you decide who you really are. Not when it's hard, but when it's easy to give in. Because the ego doesn't just want to help you cope. It wants to help you celebrate. And in that celebration, it plants seeds of delay, entitlement, softness. You don't need to punish yourself. This isn't about rejecting joy or progress. It's about learning the difference between sheer satisfaction and completion. You can be satisfied with your growth and still choose to continue. You can be proud without making pride an excuse to regress. The key is remembering that self-respect is built by continuing what you've started, not by resting in the illusion that the work is already done. So watch yourself in moments of victory. Listen to the compliments that rise in your head. Catch the ego when it says, "You're better than most people." Catch it when it says, "You've done more than enough." Catch it when it says, "You can afford to slip." And instead of arguing, just ask one quiet question. Is this helping me become who I said I wanted to be? Because if the answer is no, then it's not self-care. It's self-sabotage, disguised in celebration. Now that you've seen how ego turns your progress into a permission slip, we go deeper. The next chapter reveals how the most dangerous thoughts often come wrapped in the softest reasoning. The words we tell ourselves that feel harmless, temporary, just this once. Ego doesn't always need to win the war. It just needs to win the next moment. And it does that by disguising itself as mercy. Not punishment, not sabotage, but a break. One small break, a step off the path, only for now. Just this once. It's a phrase so soft, so convincing, so gentle, you don't see the cost until it's too late. Because nothing ever happens just once. The ego knows that. That's why it offers you that deal. A deal it knows you'll take, because it sounds harmless, reasonable, human. But just this once is a lie the ego tells when it wants to break your identity without alerting your discipline. You won't feel like you quit. You'll feel like you adjusted. You won't feel like you gave in. You'll feel like you compromised. And compromise feels like control. But it isn't. It's decay in disguise. You don't destroy your habits in loud moments of defeat. You destroy them in these quiet agreements. The skipped workout because it's raining. The late start because you deserved a slower morning. The impulsive snack because it's not that bad. One harmless exception, that's all it seems. But it's not the action that's dangerous. It's the agreement underneath it. Because when you accept the story, you accept the identity shift. You become someone who negotiates with their own standard. That's when the fall begins, not from failure, but from permission. Every time you choose just this once, you're feeding a version of you that doesn't care about your goals. And worse, you're proving to that version that you'll listen, that you'll obey. And next time, it won't have to fight as hard, because you've already said yes before. The gate is open, and the ego never closes doors it knows it can walk through again. This isn't about perfection. It's about pattern recognition, because once becomes twice, twice becomes habit, habit becomes identity, and once you've shifted your identity back into the one who breaks promises, even with a smile, it's twice as hard to return. The ego knows that. That's why it doesn't attack you head-on. It waits for your tired days, your emotional days, your high achievement days. And then it whispers, "Relax, you've done enough. Come on, just this once." And if you nod even slightly, the shift has already begun. You think you're choosing freedom, but the ego doesn't offer freedom. It offers momentary escape at the cost of long-term clarity. And here's the irony. What starts as a break from discipline eventually becomes the burden you carry. One small step off course doesn't feel like much, until you look up and realize you've wandered miles from who you were trying to become. The people who master themselves aren't the ones who never hear the whisper. They're the ones who recognize it when it comes, who know that the most dangerous phrases are the ones that feel the safest. Just this once is not a small choice. It's a vote for the ego's control, a vote against your intention, a vote that says, "I'd rather feel better now than become better later." So how do you escape this illusion? Not by arguing with the thought, but by exposing it. The moment you hear it, speak its name. Say out loud or to yourself, "That's the ego offering me a comfortable exit." Label it. That's how you reclaim authority. Once named, it loses power. Once named, you see the trick. And when you see it clearly, you're no longer negotiating. You're deciding. You don't need to be harsh. You don't need to hate yourself for wanting relief. But you do need to choose the version of you that leads, not the one that pleads. And that version doesn't beg for ease. It asks for alignment. Because when you're aligned, the word "it just" disappears. There is no just this once. There is only, does this honor who I'm becoming? Or does it excuse who I've been? One choice at a time. That's all it takes. That's all it's ever taken. And this choice, the one in front of you, this is the one that matters most. Because this one proves who's in charge. And the ego is always watching, always waiting for your next decision to become your next identity. Now that you've seen how ego bends your boundaries through kindness, we expose its obsession with something even more fragile, how you look. Because sometimes, the desire to appear disciplined is what destroys real self-control. Ego doesn't crave growth. It craves appearance. It doesn't care if you're disciplined. It only cares if others think you are. That's its nature. Surface over substance. Image over integrity. The ego is addicted to how things look, not how they are. And if you don't recognize that, it will quietly guide your life toward performance instead of purpose. This is why so many people post about discipline more than they practice it. Why they obsess over showing productivity rather than building it. Why they curate their progress like a highlight reel, not because they're proud of the effort, but because they're addicted to the perception. It feels like success, but it's not. It's ego with a camera. And when the lens is on, you act. But when it turns off, what's left? The danger here is subtle. When your ego ties your identity to how others perceive you, self-control becomes an act, not a value. You'll wake up early for the photo. You'll journal for the story. You'll work out for the approval. But when no one's watching, when there's nothing to post, when there's no applause to earn, the performance stops. And that's when your real discipline is exposed. Not when people are impressed, but when no one sees. The ego tells you that how you look defines who you are. That if you're seen as focused, then you must be focused. But identity built on visibility is weak. Because what happens when the audience disappears? Who are you when the likes stop, the views drop, the compliments fade? If your self-control depends on being observed, then it was never yours. It belonged to the image you crafted, not the self you ignored. True discipline doesn't announce itself. It doesn't care about recognition. It happens in silence, in places where no praise reaches, in choices that never get documented. The ego hates that because it can't use silence. It can't use private struggle. It can't feed on quiet. So it convinces you that your journey isn't real unless someone else sees it, that your habits aren't valid unless they're shared, that your growth needs proof. But the strongest people are the ones whose proof lives in their actions, not their projections. This is why ego-dominated discipline always collapses. Because it's not built to last. It's built to impress. It's aesthetic, not foundational. It wears the clothes of control, the routine, the plan, the ambition. But underneath, it's hollow. Because it was never about becoming better. It was about being seen as better. There's nothing wrong with documenting your path, with being proud of progress. But ask yourself, am I doing this because it strengthens me, or because it props up an image I'm afraid to lose? Because when your discipline becomes theater, you forget who you're doing it for. You forget the silence that shaped you, the private decisions that no one clapped for, the early mornings and lonely nights that no one will ever see. That's where the real power is. Not in being noticed, but in not needing to be. Let go of the performance. Let go of the illusion that external validation makes your path more valid. Your growth is not a product. It's not content. It's not a costume. It's a commitment, one that doesn't need lighting, editing, or approval. And the more you detach from the desire to be seen, the more you'll begin to see yourself clearly. Not the version that sells, the version that endures. The ego is clever. It will even let you build good habits, as long as you use them to feed the mask. But masks are heavy, and the longer you wear them, the more distant you become from who you were meant to be. Take it off, not with force, with honesty. Ask, if no one ever saw this, would I still do it? That answer reveals your truth. Now that you've exposed the ego's hunger for attention, it's time to face the darker trick. The one where ego turns self-control into something cold, rigid, and lifeless. A prison you build around yourself in the name of discipline. There's a point in the path where discipline starts to feel unnatural. Not because it's failing, but because it's been hijacked. Somewhere along the way, control stops being clarity and starts being containment. What began as an act of strength turns into a performance of restriction. You're no longer choosing. You're bracing. You're clenching. You're holding your breath and calling it self-mastery. But real control doesn't suffocate. It breathes. The ego knows that if it can't defeat you with chaos, it will try to defeat you with rigidity. It takes your pursuit of discipline and hardens it. Not to help you grow, but to trap you in a fragile version of yourself, one that breaks the moment life deviates from plan. That's the lie of control, the belief that if you just lock everything down tight enough, you'll never fall. But all that pressure creates the exact collapse you're trying to avoid. You become addicted to the feeling of holding on instead of the practice of letting go intelligently. Containment is control without trust. It's driven by fear, not principle. You don't avoid the wrong thing because it no longer tempts you. You avoid it because you're terrified of what you'll become if you slip. So you build a system, a routine, a set of rules so strict that even the slightest deviation feels like failure. And that's when you know you've lost touch with clarity. Because true self-control includes adaptability. It flows with intention. It bends without breaking. The ego, on the other hand, demands perfection because it fears exposure. If your discipline only works under ideal conditions, it's not discipline, it's dependency. It's a mask worn by the part of you that can't handle disorder. And that part is run by the ego, not because it seeks excellence, but because it dreads being revealed as flawed. The ego fears the moments when control slips, because in those moments, you see what you've been avoiding. You see that your grip was not a sign of strength, but of insecurity. and the ego can't tolerate that kind of honesty. Real control is subtle. It's quiet. It doesn't draw attention to itself. It's the choice to act from values even when circumstances shift. It's the ability to respond instead of react. And it doesn't panic when the routine gets interrupted. It adapts, because it knows that true mastery isn't about obeying a plan. It's about becoming someone who doesn't collapse when the plan falls apart. The ego will convince you that strictness is purity. That discipline means never failing, never feeling, never adjusting. But that kind of rigidity doesn't make you strong. It makes you brittle. And brittle people shatter under pressure, not because they're weak, but because they were never taught to bend. That's the danger of containment. It looks like control from the outside, but on the inside, it's fear with a schedule. You don't become unshakable by resisting everything. You become unshakable by understanding what shakes you and choosing wisely. The ego can't make those choices. It only knows how to restrict. It only knows how to build cages, then decorate them with words like discipline, grind, sacrifice. But you were never meant to live in a cage, no matter how noble it looks. Ask yourself, do I feel free in my routine, or do I feel trapped by it? Am I acting from clarity or from fear of slipping? If your discipline doesn't allow room for breath, for adjustment, for thought, it's not discipline anymore. It's ego in uniform. And the moment something breaks that routine, the ego will shame you for failing, even though it set you up to fail by making perfection the only acceptable outcome. Let go of containment. Let go of the idea that control means rigidity. Learn to move with precision, not pressure. Learn to respond with intention, not fear. Learn to trust yourself, not just in moments of strength, but in moments of change. That's real power. Not how tightly you can hold on, but how calmly you can adapt without losing who you are. Now that we've stripped away the illusion of rigid control, we arrive at the heart of ego's most silent fear. The one thing it can't survive. The one space it cannot manipulate. Stillness. Stillness is not the absence of motion. It's the absence of distraction. It's the silence where truth speaks loudest and where the ego feels most exposed. That's why it runs from stillness. Not because it's boring, but because it's revealing. Stillness has no noise to hide behind, no stimulation to cloak discomfort, no audience to perform for. Just you, unfiltered, undistracted, unnumbed. And for the ego, that is unbearable. The ego doesn't fear failure. It doesn't even fear pain. It fears what happens when there's nothing left to react to. When the screen goes black. When the room gets quiet. When you're forced to sit with your thoughts without interruption. That's when you see the truth. That's when you see what all the noise was covering. And the ego will do anything to keep that moment from happening. It's why you reach for your phone when you're alone. Why silence in conversations feels awkward. Why rest feels like laziness. Why the moment you stop moving, your mind begins spinning. The ego isn't just uncomfortable with stillness. It's incompatible with it. Because stillness doesn't praise. It doesn't distract. It doesn't justify. It just reflects. And reflection reveals all the lies you've been living with. This is the paradox. We crave peace, but we resist the only space where peace can live. We want clarity, but we fill every quiet moment with stimulation. The ego tells you that motion is meaning. That activity equals worth. That if you're still, you're falling behind. But that's projection. The ego fears stillness because stillness reveals what you actually think, what you actually feel, what you actually need to face. In stillness, you can't pretend. You can't posture, you can't curate. You meet yourself as you are, and sometimes that version is unmotivated, lost, angry, weak. So the ego says, keep moving, open something, watch something, do something. Not because you're progressing, but because you're escaping. And in that escape, the ego survives. But if you can resist the urge to run, if you can remain in stillness without trying to change what you find, something shifts. You start to see your patterns. You notice which thoughts are loudest. You feel the weight of the emotions you've been outrunning. And instead of being consumed by them, you begin to understand them. You begin to recognize which ones are yours and which ones were planted there by egoic fear, insecurity, performance. Stillness isn't easy. It's not supposed to be. It's confrontation in its purest form. But it's also liberation. Because once you learn to sit in stillness, the ego loses its grip. It can't manipulate you with boredom. It can't control you with urgency. It can't bait you with noise. You've seen behind the curtain. And what's there, in that quiet, is who you really are. The most dangerous lies the ego tells are the ones that say silence is wasted time, that introspection is weakness, that contemplation is procrastination. But the strongest people in history, the clearest minds, all knew this truth. Without stillness, you can't see yourself. And if you can't see yourself, you can't change. You can't lead. You can't endure. You're just reacting, spinning, performing, surviving. When you build a life that has no silence, you build a life the ego controls. Because it thrives in stimulation, it thrives in speed, it thrives in momentum without direction. But if you want to master yourself, not just your schedule, not just your image, but your inner life, you have to sit still long enough to hear what's really going on inside. That's where strength is born. Not in how much you can carry, but in how long you can sit with what's heavy. Not in how fast you can move, but in how deeply you can feel without flinching. Stillness is a mirror, and most people break it before it shows them what they need to see. You don't need more input. You don't need more tips, more content, more motivation. You need more stillness. Because in that silence, the truth becomes louder than the ego's lies. And once you hear it, once you really hear it, you don't unhear it. You don't go back to noise. You start making different choices. Not because someone told you to, but because stillness showed you why. Now that we've stripped the noise and sat in the discomfort of silence, it's time to face the most avoided moment of all. Not the stillness itself, but the reflection it brings. The mirror the ego fears most. The one you've been walking past. The one you need to finally look into. There is a moment most people spend their lives avoiding. It's not a moment of crisis, not a breakdown, not even regret. It's the moment of recognition. The moment you meet your own reflection. Not the physical one in the mirror, but the one inside. The mirror of honesty, of memory, of patterns. The one that shows you everything you've chosen to ignore. And when you finally look into it, even for a second, you realize something quietly devastating. You always knew. You knew the voice that told you to delay wasn't truth. You knew the habit you called rest was really escape. You knew the argument you started was ego, not justice. You knew the decisions you made weren't aligned with who you said you wanted to become. But you looked away. Not because you were weak, but because you were afraid of what honesty might demand of you. That's how the ego survives. Not by overpowering you, but by making you look in every direction but inward. It will let you analyze others, criticize the world, obsess over routines, productivity, information, anything to avoid the mirror, because the mirror is not a place of thought. It's a place of recognition. And once you see the truth there, you lose the ability to pretend you didn't. You've probably stood there before, after a setback, after a fight, after a promise you broke again. You looked briefly and then turned away, told yourself you were tired, that tomorrow would be different, that it wasn't that serious. But a part of you knew. That small knot in your chest, that wasn't shame. It was clarity trying to rise, and the ego buried it. Again. This is the moment where change actually begins. Not in motivation, not in productivity hacks, not in new goals or better systems, but here, in this private confrontation with yourself, where you stop performing, where you stop defending, where you say, without noise, without panic, this is what I've been doing, this is where I've been hiding, this is what I need to face. No more narratives, no more diluted language. You weren't a little off track. You betrayed your own standard. You weren't processing emotions. You were avoiding responsibility. You weren't protecting your peace. You were refusing growth. And none of this makes you bad. It makes you human. But humanity without honesty becomes mediocrity. You don't rise through softness alone. You rise through the pain of recognition and the decision to stop lying to yourself. The ego hates this. It will do anything to pull you away from the mirror. It will flood your mind with distractions, comparisons, blame. It will try to convince you that self-reflection is self-hatred, that awareness is a burden, that responsibility is cruelty. But those are the last screams of a collapsing empire, because once you see what's real, ego loses its throne. Ask yourself now, what have I been avoiding? What truth keeps tapping my shoulder in quiet moments? What pattern do I keep justifying? And what would happen if, for once, I didn't look away? No one else needs to know. No one else needs to see this part of you. This is between you and the person you could have been all along. The one you buried under explanations, under noise, under pride. You don't need to destroy the past. You don't need to erase the mistakes. You only need to see them clearly, without emotion, without panic, with calm, with presence, like a surgeon or a philosopher. That's what the Stoics understood, that suffering isn't in truth, it's in the refusal to accept it. Once accepted, it becomes fuel. The moment you face what you've been avoiding, everything begins to shift. Slowly, quietly, permanently. The mirror doesn't judge you, it doesn't punish, it reflects. And if you have the strength to look, truly look, it will give you something the ego never could. Direction. Now that the mirror has spoken, there's only one step left. The final movement. The quiet act that marks the return to your own authority. Not a loud change, not a dramatic declaration, just a single calm moment where you take it all back. There won't be a sign, no applause, no lightning in the sky. The moment you take your life back doesn't look like victory. It looks like silence, a small decision, a quiet rejection of the story you've been telling yourself. And that's what makes it powerful. No announcement, no performance, just clarity applied. You wake up and choose not to follow the same impulse. You feel the same urge, the same excuse forming in the back of your mind, and this time, you don't answer it. Not because it's easy, not because it's gone, but because you see it for what it is, a suggestion, not a command. That's the shift. The voice is still there, but it's no longer the one leading. There will be no dramatic proof, no instant reward. No one will congratulate you for sitting still when you used to run, for acting with patience where you used to react. But you'll feel it, not on the surface, in your center. In the calm that comes from choosing the harder thing for the right reason. That calm is the evidence. That stillness earned in silence is the reward. You don't need to burn the old version of yourself. You only need to stop feeding it. Every time you obeyed the ego, you kept it alive. You clothed it in your actions, gave it breath through your decisions. But now you're starving it, and ego starves fast. It needs constant approval, constant stimulation, constant permission. Starve it of that, and it begins to shrink. And in that shrinking, you find your real strength, the one that doesn't yell, the one that doesn't need to be seen. Taking your life back isn't about changing everything. It's about changing direction. And the smallest shift in direction, held consistently, moves you miles away from who you were. The ego wants grand declarations, dramatic cuts, all or nothing vows. But that's theater. That's how you fall again. Real change is invisible at first. It's a whisper that you choose not to ignore, a moment that passes without indulgence. a choice made without an audience. Today is that moment. The moment you say, "No, I'm not following that thought. No, I'm not answering that urge. No, I'm not feeding that part of me anymore." And the more times you say it, the more natural it becomes. Until what once felt like effort becomes identity. Until the part of you that used to betray yourself becomes the part that protects you. This is how power returns. Not with noise, with awareness. Not through domination, through discernment. When the ego speaks, you don't fight it. You see it. And in that seeing, you choose something else. Something slower, something stronger, something quieter. And that quiet becomes your foundation. You don't need to feel ready. You don't need to be perfect. You only need to choose, today, to stop giving away your control to a voice that was never speaking for your future. It was only echoing your past, and now you're done echoing. There is no final breakthrough, no final enemy, no final test. Just this, a steady return to yourself, to the version of you that doesn't need permission to act with intention, that doesn't wait for motivation to do what must be done, that doesn't chase the feeling. It becomes the standard. But next time you won't face it the same. So don't wait for the ego to disappear. It won't, but its power over you already has. Right now, in this breath, in this sentence, you've seen it, named it, walked through it, and now there is only one thing left to do. Live like you remember who you are. And if this reminded you of something you've been needing to hear, leave your mark below. Speak to someone who might be walking the same path. Subscribe if this voice helps anchor you, and return when the noise returns, because it will.